Welcome back to eCoreAcademy, everyone. My name is Anita, and I am one of the teachers and co-founders here. As you can see, we have a new Biology 1 video, and it's going to be on the properties of water. As you can see, it's part 1. I think we'll have about 3 parts, so 3 parts to this lesson entirely on water. And you might be thinking, water? Why are we having so many lessons on water? But trust me, when it comes to biology, water is essential. We'll be talking about exactly why it's so important in this video. And it has so many unique properties that are essential to life. And because biology is pretty much the study of life, water plays a big role in every single topic we're going to learn. So specifically in this video, we're going to be defining what a molecule is because water is considered a molecule. So we'll be understanding why is it a molecule, what exactly is a molecule. Then we'll be talking about the kinds of bonds that you find in water. There are 2 bonds. We'll be looking at one today, and then in the next video, we'll be exploring the other one that is so important that it's another type of bond that you'll also find in DNA. So that's also another important bond. And then lastly, we'll talk about polarity and talk about what exactly polarity is. And before I get into this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit the like button, the subscribe button, the post notification bell. If you could drop a comment down below and and share using all our socials. Okay, let's get into this first slide. The big question is, what is water? So think about what water is. You might be thinking, oh, it's what I drink every day. It's what's in the food I eat. It's what part of my body is made up of. Those are all correct, but there's so much more to water than just that. So by definition, if you found it in a dictionary, water is an inorganic, tasteless, odorless, and colorless chemical. So inorganic for our purposes is anything without carbon in it. Carbon is pretty much the atom of life, if you want to think of it like that. Almost anything that has carbon is living. There are exceptions, but that's pretty much what defines life, carbon, especially the carbon backbone and skeleton we'll be looking at that makes up all these macromolecules. Water is also tasteless. You probably drank it before. It usually doesn't taste like anything unless you add like sweetener or sugar or whatever. It's also odorless, so it doesn't have any kind of smell, and it's colorless, so it's transparent. You can see right through it. That is again the dictionary definition. Just to nod ahead at how abundant water is, it's found everywhere in Earth's atmosphere. So our atmosphere, parts of our atmosphere. Oh gosh, this was from 7th grade. I don't remember the parts. It's like the lithosphere, the troposphere, things like that. Water is found as clouds, as water vapor, and it's found in the atmosphere, but also on the surface of the Earth in the forms of water tables that are underneath the ground, aquifers, oceans, lakes, rivers, streams, all these different places you'll find water. It covers about 70% of the Earth's atmosphere and the surface of the Earth. So that is a lot of space considering how large the planet is. And in regards to organisms, like for example, the human, 60% of our body is made out of water. This water can be found in our blood, in our organs, in our cells. There's just water everywhere, and you might not think of it right now, but it's pretty much present everywhere you are. The reason why water is so abundant is because it's vital for life, and you might be wondering, why does life need water? Well, water is used to dissolve nutrients in our body when we consume food. The food that we consume, we can't just immediately turn it into just use that food and make it usable energy. There's processes through metabolism that our body has to go through to convert it into usable energy. And then all these processes water aids because it'll help dissolve nutrients. If you guys remember, solutions are kinds of mixtures in which a solute, which is what is being dissolved by something called a solvent. So water, we'll learn about this later, it's considered the solvent of life because it can actually dissolve most nutrients, most substances can be dissolved by water. And additionally, it'll regulate internal body temperature. We'll be talking about things like high heat of vaporization, and those things help kind of give you an idea of how water regulates temperature. So a good example would be, for example, a city that is in the mountains versus a city that is by the ocean. So the one by the ocean will see less temperature fluctuation over the course of the year in comparison to the city that's in the mountains or far away from a body of water, because water actually helps regulate the temperature. So we'll talk about that later on, but it also helps regulate our body temperature. If you know, humans have a body temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and there's a very small range that we can maintain for our bodies to still function. For example, if we go too high, our organs will boil. If we go too cold, we just our body will freeze. So water helps us keep that like human body temperature in that very small optimal range. And lastly, it facilitates chemical reactions between monomers and polymers in the body. We'll be talking about what monomers and polymers are, but think of monomers like they're macromolecules. Think of them like puzzle pieces, and polymers are the puzzle that you actually make after putting all these monomers together. What water does is it'll help these monomers, which are like the puzzle pieces, link together through reactions to make polymers. And at the same time, it can help polymers, which are that huge puzzle, be broken down back into the puzzle pieces. These two processes are called dehydration synthesis and hydrolysis, and we'll be talking about them later and how water is so important for all these chemical reactions that are going on in our body. So, as you all know, just a chemical property, water can exist as a solid, liquid, and a gas. Solid, for example, ice; liquid, the water we drink; and then gas, water vapor, steam, etc. And water, I just wanted to quickly discuss this, but water on other planets can therefore indicate signs of life. For example, we're doing a lot of studies on Mars, and scientists are trying to find water on Mars, because wherever water is, life can thrive. So if there's, for example, if there's water present on other planets, that can mean that there's a form of life on that planet, because water sustains life. So that's why water can be so important in like that exploration kind of part of our society. And as you can see here, this is just a small diagram. Here's an ice cube, which is the solid form. Here's a little puddle, which is the liquid form of water, and here's that puddle evaporating. So that's the gaseous gas form. So let's talk about water as a molecule. First, let's define what a molecule is. So a molecule is a combination of two or more atoms joined together by a covalent bond. Typically, you will find molecules are formed between atoms of nonmetals and are electrically neutral. So, for example, in a water molecule, you have an oxygen bonded to two hydrogens. They're all nonmetals, so they're all found on the right side of the periodic table. Water is oxygen is usually a gas. Hydrogen is also a gas. Well, hydrogen is found on the left side of the periodic table, but it's an exception. So it's a gas, and so is oxygen. It's also a gas. They will bond to each other by a covalent bond. Remember, covalent bonds are bonds between atoms in which the atoms share electrons. So oxygen is going to share electrons with the two hydrogen atoms. They'll bond, and then they'll form a water molecule. And overall, the water molecule is considered electrically neutral, so it has no charge. Just keep that in mind. All molecules are actually electrically neutral. Water is specifically a unique molecule with unique properties because it is held together by polar covalent bonds. If you all remember, polar covalent bonds are bonds in which there is a sharing of electrons, but that sharing is not necessarily equal. For example, in a water molecule, you have two hydrogen atoms that are covalently bonded to an oxygen atom. So each hydrogen atom is sharing electrons with the oxygen atom. As you can see in these diagrams. So this diagram right here, it's called a planetary model of a water molecule. So this right here, this is going to be your oxygen atom. You can see this blue area is the nucleus. It has 8 protons in the nucleus, and it's going to have 8 electrons. There are going to be 2 electrons in this innermost shell, and the innermost shell is filled by just 2 electrons. So this one is filled. This outer shell needs 8 electrons to be filled. However, oxygen naturally, because it has 2 electrons in the inner shell, 8 minus 2 is 6, so it'll have 6 electrons in the outer shell. So what happens is these two hydrogen atoms, a hydrogen atom is pretty much just a proton and then an electron. So the proton makes up the nucleus, the electron orbits around the nucleus. So as you can see, these are the two hydrogen atoms. They have protons in the middle, and then they'll each have their own electron. So what happens is these hydrogen atoms want to complete this shell right here, and because this shell can be thought of like this inner shell, this shell only needs 2 electrons. So each of these hydrogen atoms are looking for one more electron. So oxygen can pretty much give each of them an electron and share, and each of these hydrogens can give back an electron. So think of it like sharing. So this hydrogen is sharing 2 electrons with the oxygen. This hydrogen is sharing 2 electrons with the oxygen. However, oxygen keeps 4 electrons to itself because these hydrogens don't need any more than 2 electrons. That's why this is weakly negative, because the oxygen almost, you can think of it like hogging. That's why it's polar covalent, because oxygen's more electronegative, so it wants more of the electrons. So it's going to keep the electrons to itself, 4 of the electrons to itself, and then it's only going to share 1 electron with each, so it's going to share a total of 2 electrons with the hydrogens. The hydrogens, meanwhile, are weakly positive because anyway, these electrons are going to be pulled towards the oxygen. So in comparison to the oxygen in this molecule, the oxygen is very electronegative, but that means that these hydrogens are electrically positive. So or partially positive. So that's what these symbols stand for. This means a partial negative charge, and this means a partial positive charge. Here you'll see another depiction of a water molecule. This is called a three-dimensional model of a water molecule. It's also called a space-filling molecule. A space-filling model. Here, this blue, you can obviously see the oxygen atom is a lot bigger than the hydrogen. So you can obviously tell that this is the oxygen. It has a partial negative charge. Remember, because it's hogging these 4 electrons. And then these hydrogens have a partial positive charge because they're only sharing 2 electrons each with the oxygen. Meanwhile, over here we have a ball and stick model, because you can see like the atoms are the balls and then the bonds are represented as sticks. So each of these sticks are a polar covalent bond. Again, the oxygen atom and the 2 hydrogen atoms. So that's water as a molecule. So now let's look at the types of bonds in water. The first kind of bond we just talked about is going to be a polar covalent bond. And the polar covalent bonds are found within the molecule. So as you saw, one water molecule has a total of 3 atoms, the 1 oxygen and the 2 hydrogens. So the polar covalent bonds are going to be found within the molecule, as in it's going to be found between the atoms that form that molecule. So as we said, there's going to be one polar covalent bond between the oxygen and the first hydrogen. There's going to be another polar covalent bond between the oxygen and the second hydrogen. And remember, polar covalent bonds, again, unequal sharing of electrons. So the hydrogen is going to give one of its electrons, oxygen is going to give one of its electrons, and then those 2 atoms will share 2 electrons between themselves. The same thing for the second hydrogen. That hydrogen will give 1 electron, and then oxygen will give up 1 electron, but then they'll end up sharing those. And meanwhile, it's unequal because, if you want to think of it like this, oxygen's like, hey, I'll give each of you 1 electron, but really in the back, it's like I'm keeping 4 electrons to myself. So if you want to think of it that way, it's not equally sharing it, but it is sharing. Meanwhile, let's talk about hydrogen bonds as well. I don't know if you've heard this term before, but it's another kind of bond. Realistically, it is not a bond because it is actually just an interaction. That's what my AP biology teacher actually says this year. They don't tell you this in biology 1, but hydrogen bonds are not actual bonds. They're just interactions. They're just attractions between molecules. These are found between water molecules. So like we said, the polar covalent bond is found within the water molecule. The hydrogen bonds are found between different water molecules. So if this is water molecule A, I have a polar covalent bond between my first hydrogen, my oxygen, and my second hydrogen and my oxygen. But if I have another water molecule B, these 2 water molecules will be attracted to each other because of these things that we're calling hydrogen bonds. So hydrogen bonds are what make 2 water molecules attracted to one another. So like it says, between one water molecule and another, it can be in a gas, liquid, or solid. For example, in a solid, hydrogen bonds will be a bit more turgid or a little bit more stiff, and then as a liquid, they'll be a bit more flexible. As a gas, they're literally just non-existent. Water molecules are just bumping against each other and just floating by each other in a gas. So we'll talk about those more, and we'll talk about how they form, what they form between, and things like that. But on the next slide, I will focus on uh, polar covalent bonds and things like that. So in this picture over here of a single water molecule, I'm trying to depict the polar covalent bond. So as we said, imagine those 4 electrons up here hogged by the oxygen. Meanwhile, the hydrogens are sharing 2 electrons each with the oxygen. That's why we have that partial positive and partial negative up here. Something I do want to mention is you'll learn more about this in chemistry, but you can actually tell just by looking at like the structure of a molecule if it's polar, if it's polar like this. So polar molecules typically don't have a symmetrical shape. Like for example, if I cut this in half, down the middle, yeah, I could have 2 even halves, but what if I cut it like diagonally like this? I won't have 2 equal halves. I'll have a part of an oxygen and then an entire hydrogen, and then I'll have less than half of the oxygen and then another hydrogen. So think of it just symmetrically. If you were just to slice this water molecule, it's just not going to be symmetrical if you just slice it any given way. So that's another way of seeing that saying that it's a polar molecule. Over here, I want to just quickly show you, these are what hydrogen bonds look like. So you can see there are 5 water molecules in this picture, and they even depict the polar covalent bonds between the oxygen and the hydrogens. But if you see, there are these long lines between the water molecules, and if you see, these long lines are attached between between the oxygen of one water molecule and then the hydrogen atom of another water molecule. And you can see the same here, the same here, the same here. So we'll talk about that later on, but because hydrogen has a partial positive charge and the oxygen has a partial negative charge, remember opposite charges attract. So these are not technically bonds, they're just attractions between the positive hydrogen and then the negative oxygen between 2 different water molecules. So now let's specifically talk about polar covalent bonds. I'm just going to break this down to make it easier for you guys to understand. So the polar covalent bonds, again, electrons are shared unequally between atoms. Electrons are shared. It's not like an ionic bond where one atom just entirely gives up an electron, whereas the other atom just takes that electron in. Instead, there's going to be some sharing, but it's not done equally. It'll result in one atom having more electrons to itself than the other atoms in the bond. So, for example, in water, electrons spend more time around the oxygen. Like we saw in that picture, there were 4 more electrons kept to the other side of oxygen, whereas the hydrogens were on the other side of oxygen, and they were away from those 4 electrons. So those 4 electrons won't go near the hydrogens. The oxygen will just keep those 4 electrons to itself. So if you look at the periodic table in the outer shell of oxygen, like we were saying, oxygen has 2 shells. The inner shell, we already said, has 2 electrons. The inner shell only needs 2 electrons and it's full. It's happy. It doesn't need any more electrons. But oxygen has 8 protons, and if it's electrically neutral, it has the same amount of electrons, meaning it also has 8 electrons. So if it also has 8 electrons, that means if 2 are in the inner shell, there are going to be 8 minus 2, which equals 6 in the second shell. And the second shell is its valence shell, meaning it's its outer shell. So it's going to have 6 valence electrons. So valence electrons are the electrons in the outer shell that are responsible for bonding and interactions of an atom. So oxygen has 6 valence electrons. And remember, the second shell wants 8 electrons. So this first shell wants 2 electrons to be full. The second shell wants 8 electrons to be full. And remember, atoms are trying to find that full outer shell because they want to reach stability. So if you want to think of it like they want to fully saturate themselves, so fully fill themselves up, and then they'll obtain the same stable configuration that the noble gases have. So that's why oxygen really wants 2 more electrons to get a complete outer shell of 8 valence electrons. If you look at the hydrogen is the first element on the periodic table. It has an atomic number of 1. So it has 1 proton in the nucleus. It has no neutrons. But because it's electrically neutral, it also has 1 electron. Hydrogen is so small that unlike oxygen, it doesn't need a second shell. It only has that 1 shell, and it has 1 electron in that shell. Because that shell is the inner shell and it wants just 2 electrons and it'll be happy, hydrogen is searching for 1 more electron to complete its outer shell. Therefore, oxygen will bond with 2 hydrogen atoms. Oxygen is going to share 2 of the 6 valence electrons in its outer shell. So it's going to keep 4 to itself, and it's going to share 2 electrons, 1 with each of the 2 hydrogen atoms it bonds with. But the hydrogens are each going to have one electron, and they're going to in turn share that one electron with oxygen. So if at the end of the day everyone is happy, 4 total electrons are being shared, oxygen keeps 4 to itself, it shares 2 with one hydrogen and then 2 with another hydrogen, so it has 8 electrons. Each hydrogen is sharing 2 electrons with the oxygen, so they each have 2, they're happy. So it ends up being a happy arrangement, even though oxygen is keeping 4 electrons to itself. And the reason why, like I keep telling you, oxygen is not extremely more negative than the hydrogens, it's just partially more negative. That end of the molecule is just a bit more negative than the other end of the molecule with the hydrogens. The hydrogens, like we said, don't hog the electrons, as we see. Oxygen does hog 4 electrons, so it has a partial negative charge, but the hydrogens have a partial positive charge. So I just wanted to show you all a water diagram. So, like we said, 8 protons in the nucleus of oxygen. This inner shell right here has 2 electrons. The outer shell has the brown, whatever the electrons in brown are oxygen's its original electrons. So these 6 are from oxygen. As we can see, the 2 hydrogen atoms here each have 1 proton in the nucleus, and these red electrons represent hydrogen's original electrons. But as you can see, the oxygen will overlap with the 2 hydrogens, and that just represents the covalent bond, so the sharing. So it'll share one of its own electrons with the hydrogen, while the hydrogen shares one of its electrons in turn. So everyone is happy. Like we said, covalent bonds here. Like we said, the hydrogen is going to have a partial positive charge, because if you see the rest of its electron shell, pretty much empty, no other electrons. So you can think of it like if there's no other electrons here and there's just that proton like pretty much out here in this space, it's going to have a partial positive charge. On the flip side, if you look at oxygen, it has 2 electrons up here and 2 electrons up here. So if you look in this area where my laser is, there's just a really high concentration of electrons, and that's what makes it partially negative. These amount of electrons just kind of overwhelm this part of the molecule. That's why it's partially negative. And if you see the term here, lone pair, so you see 2 electrons over here and 2 electrons over here. In molecules, whenever you see a lone pair, it's pretty much just 2 electrons that one of the atoms is keeping to itself and not sharing. So you can think of it like they're lonely. They're not part of any bond, any covalent bonds. They're just lonely. They're just hogged. They're just kept away from everyone else because that one atom is just being selfish and keeping those electrons to itself. So here, let's talk about polarity. So polarity is because the end of the water molecule with the oxygen is partially negative, while the end with the hydrogens is partially positive, the molecule is polar. So polar pretty much means when the electric distribution of electrons is not equal. So what this means is if we looked at that oxygen, we said that water molecule, the oxygen atom was partially negative because it kept those 4 electrons to itself, whereas the hydrogens were positive because the oxygen was pretty much just trying to pull hydrogen's electrons away from it because oxygen was more electronegative. Because in that water molecule, the oxygen end of the molecule is more negative and the hydrogen end is more positive, the molecule is polar. And polar, like we said, the electrical distributions of electrons is not equal. So there's not, like, if you think of the molecule, one side of the molecule with the oxygen has just so many more electrons than the other side of the molecule with the hydrogens, which has much less electrons. Therefore, the way the electrons are distributed or spread out throughout the molecule is not equal. If you want to think of it this way, the side with the oxygen is just so much more heavier, so much more filled with electrons than the side with the hydrogen, which has much less. So it's not an equal share. They're not spread out equally. They're not just like spread out, dispersed throughout. They're just all concentrated more towards the oxygen. So it's not electrically that their electrical charge, the electrical charge of the electrons, is not equal throughout the molecule. So because of the electronegativity difference in molecules like water, each end of the molecule has a different charge. Like we said, oxygen is so much more electronegative than hydrogen. So oxygen has so many more electrons on its side, so it is going to have a partial negative charge like we saw. However, there's going to be total opposite charge on the other end of the molecule with the hydrogen. It's going to have a partial positive charge. Because there are 2 different charges on either side of the molecule, it's considered a polar molecule. So the charges are not equally distributed. In contrast, you guys have heard me use the term nonpolar. So, for example, with methane, when we saw that carbon atom was bonded to 4 other hydrogen atoms, that is considered nonpolar because the electric distribution of electrons is equal. So carbon has carbon has 2 electrons in its inner shell and then 4 electrons in its outer shell. So it's searching for 4 more electrons to fill its outer shell with 8. Hydrogen, like we said, has 1 electron looking for a second one to make a complete shell of 2. So if one carbon is bonded to 4 hydrogens, each hydrogen is giving 1 electron. So carbon, in a way, gains those 4 electrons, fills its outer shell. Meanwhile, it's sharing its original 4 electrons with each of the hydrogens. So at the end of the day, everyone is happy. But if you look at a diagram of methane, everything is equally shared. Carbon is not keeping its own lone pairs to itself like we saw in water. When water hogged those 2 pairs, so those 4 electrons, those 2 lone pairs at the top, carbon's not doing that in methane. It's equally sharing all of its electrons with the hydrogens. It's a non-polar covalent bond. So the electrons are equally distributed amongst the atoms in that case, and the bonds are equal, and the atom is not charged. There is no partial positive charge. There is no partial negative charge because there's not one atom just pulling all the electrons towards itself. The electrons are equally dispersed throughout the atom, so the atom is uncharged. And then we have the amphipathic molecules. Oh my god, I always struggle saying this. But they have what's called a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic end. So hydrophilic, if we break it down into the Latin roots, hydro means water. Philic means loving in hydrophilic. So hydrophilic means water loving. Hydrophobic, if we break that down, hydro means water. Phobic, however, means fearing. So water fearing, water hating, whatever you want to call it. So hydrophilic, water loving, hydrophobic, water hating. You guys should get familiar with these words because they're going to come up quite a bit when we talk about water. So hydrophilic molecules are going to be polar molecules. So the reason they're polar is because water itself is a polar molecule. And what happens is polar molecules like other polar molecules. Nonpolar molecules like other nonpolar molecules. However, polar molecules don't like nonpolar molecules, and nonpolar molecules don't like polar molecules. It goes with the saying, like dissolves like. So a polar molecule can dissolve a polar molecule. Like water can dissolve something like salt. Water can dissolve other polar molecules. However, it can't dissolve nonpolar molecules like oil. Oil is a very, very common nonpolar molecule. At the same time, oil can dissolve other nonpolar molecules, but oil can't dissolve water. That's why when you pour water and oil in a glass, they don't mix together because they cannot dissolve in each other because water is polar, oil is nonpolar. So on the flip side, we have something called an amphipathic molecule. Going along with that, hydrophilic means polar and hydrophobic means nonpolar. You can think of it that way. Because if you think of it, hydrophilic means polar. Therefore, molecules that are hydrophilic or water-loving are also polar, so water can dissolve those molecules. However, molecules that are hydrophobic, like oil, are also nonpolar, meaning that water cannot dissolve them. They hate water. They just want to get away from it, if you want to think of it that way. But when we have amphipathic molecules, these are molecules that have both polar sides and they have nonpolar sides. I'm not going to get into too much detail about it, but one example is soap. For instance, soap. When you wash a dish, for example, if you have like a cooking pan that's coated in oil, if you just run water over it, it's not going to clean. It's not going to properly clean the pan, or it's going to take you so much time to get all that oil off the pan because the water can't dissolve the oil. However, soap will have one end of the soap molecule is hydrophobic, meaning it is able to dissolve that oil off the pan. The other end is hydrophilic, so it can interact with the water that's coming from the faucet. So that's pretty much it for amphipathic molecules. So now let's look at some polarity diagrams. Here we have a molecule of ammonia. So ammonia is NH3. There's one nitrogen atom and then there's 3 hydrogen atoms. This is going to be a polar molecule. So if you look at it, if we cut this molecule, for example, if I go like this, diagonal, it's not going to be cut equally. If we had one more hydrogen atom, it would be symmetrical, but it's not symmetrical because it only has these 3 hydrogen atoms. What happens is it's nitrogen is going to actually share one electron with each of these hydrogens. Each hydrogen is going to share an electron with the nitrogen, but nitrogen is going to keep its own lone pair to itself. So it's going to keep electrons to itself. So it's going to, up here, you can imagine that it's hogging its own electrons. That's why up here it says a partial negative charge, because nitrogen's hogging its electrons, whereas hydrogens are partially positive because nitrogens are pulling in those electrons. So this would be an example of a polar molecule. And remember, polar molecules are hydrophilic molecules, so they're water loving. So water is able to dissolve hydrophilic or polar molecules, because remember, like dissolves like. The next example I have here is benzene, I believe, but it is a 6-carbon molecule, and it has each of these are hydrogen atoms. I believe this is benzene. Oh my god, I can't believe this is leaving my mind. But yeah, this has 6 carbons, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 hydrogens. As you can see, it's a symmetrical molecule. If I cut it like this, if I cut it diagonally, horizontally, vertically, it's symmetrical. So in this case, the carbons are equally sharing their electrons with each of the hydrogens. So this is considered a nonpolar molecule. Nonpolar molecules are also hydrophobic molecules. Water would not be able to dissolve this molecule, but for example, maybe oil would be able to, because they are both nonpolar. And lastly, here's an example of an amphipathic molecule. So up here we have, this is called a phospholipid. We'll be talking about this when we talk about lipids, which are a kind of macromolecule. It looks kind of funky. You see this large ball, and then you see these 2 legs. This molecule makes up the cell membrane that you will see when we look more at the cell membrane in detail. So up here you see phosphate groups, and then you see a phosphate. That's what makes it a phospholipid. And then the lipid is the fat part. So these are going to be your 2 tails. This is going to be your head, and this is going to be your tails. Here's your phosphate. Here's what's called a glycerol, and then this is going to make your hydrophilic head. Down here you have a saturated fatty acid, because you see it doesn't have any kinks. We're going to be talking about all of that soon. As well, but this is called a saturated fatty acid. You can see it's straight, but this is an unsaturated fatty acid because it has this little double line, meaning it has like a kink. That's why it goes off at a weird angle like this, whereas this one is straight. This part of the molecule is hydrophilic, meaning it's water loving, it's polar. If you put this head in water, it'll get dissolved. However, these tails down here are lipids. Remember, oil is also a lipid. Lipids are nonpolar. All of them are nonpolar. They hate water. For example, if you put fat in water, it will not dissolve. It'll just sit there. So sometimes it'll even curl in on itself because it just wants to get away from the water. So it'll like coil in on itself and try to get away from the water. So that's how these tails are. So they're hydrophobic. They hate water. They're nonpolar. Because this is one molecule. One end of it is hydrophilic, one end of it's hydrophobic, meaning one end is polar, one end is nonpolar. That's why it's an amphipathic molecule. And that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please hit the like button, subscribe button, post notification bell, drop a comment down below, and share using our socials, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Please look out for the next video, and in the meantime, you can shoot us an email if you'd like at eCoreAcademy@gmail.com, and you can visit our website link, eCoreAcademy.org. Hope you enjoyed the video, and see you in the next one. Bye!